If you were to stand at the window in Hewlands and crane your neck sideways, it would be possible to see the edge of the forest. You might find it a restless, verdant, inconstant sight. The wind caresses, ruffles, disturbs the mass of leaves. Each tree answers to the weather's ministrations at a slightly different tempo from its neighbour, bending and shuddering and tossing its branches as if trying to get away from the air, from the very soil that nourishes it. That was an opening extract from Maggie O Farrell's award-winning book Hamnet, and this video is going to be an exploration of that book. There will be some spoilers as well, so bear that in mind when watching. That extract is from one of the opening chapters in one of the key settings of the book, that of Hewlands, now no longer called that. Hewlands now is known as Anne Hathaway's Cottage. So, Hamnet by Maggie O Farrell. I read this last month and really loved it. Because I live here in Shakespeare country, I thought it would be lovely to do a walking book review and to walk you through the very buildings, the very rooms, the gardens, the woods and the settings of this book, because I think the settings of this book are incredibly magical. They impact the characters. I think the character of Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife, or as she's called in this book, Agnes, I think the setting really impacts Anne's character the most. She becomes this witchy woman, and because I know Shottery incredibly well, where Anne grew up, it kind of sat right with me. Shottery is very old. It feels magical. It feels mystical. Although there aren't huge woods in Shottery, there are lots of coppices, and the cottage itself is surrounded by trees, which you'll see. All of that just sat so well with me. I also love the fact in this book that the character of William Shakespeare is actually never named. He is called the tutor or the Latin tutor. Again, that sits well with me because of my disgruntlement that I've always had that he left Anne. He left to become a playwright in London. He followed his dreams, although he did return to Stratford-upon-Avon regularly to visit his family. He still left, and that truth is incredibly well depicted in here. Also, the relationship, there isn't a lot known about the relationship. There isn't a lot written down about it that we've still got today. Talking to the Shakespeare Trust staff, they all were much of an agreement that this book kind of is about 50% fact, 50% fiction. But the facts that we do know do hint at some of the way this story went. The fact that Anne was 8 years older than Shakespeare when they married, and that was unheard of in those days. She was also 3 months pregnant, which wasn't unheard of, so that was common, but to marry a woman 8 years older was not common, and it speaks of stepping out of a societal norm that does hint at a love story, and this book does depict a love story. But I think mostly this book depicts grief and tragedy. Of course, the story focuses mostly not on William Shakespeare, who is absent in London, but on Anne. It focuses on the 3 children as well of William and Anne. So you've got Susanna, the older daughter, and then the twins that were born, Judith and Hamnet. It's a book of 2 halves. In the first half of the book, you've got William, or the Latin tutor, and Anne, or Agnes, meeting. You've got a strong setting at Hewlands. However, it is interspersed with a time frame that jumps from the past to the current, where we go to Hamnet's viewpoint, where he is desperately trying to find help for Judith, his twin sister, who has some disease, with what is hinted at here as being the plague in this book, and how she is dying and he cannot find his mum. His mum, Anne, is at Hewlands tending her bees when the book first opens, and that just blew my mind, because the far orchard where the bees are where I go to read in the garden, so I was right there. So I'm going to take you back to Hewlands, and I'm going to talk about the rest of the book whilst walking you through the very settings that you'll read about. So Hewlands, now known as Anne Hathaway's cottage, where Shakespeare's wife grew up, where her mother died and where her stepmother Joan took over, is here in Shottery. This is somewhere that I know incredibly well. The house is described as being overcrowded, which it was, with a smoke-filled hall in as the main room, where the Latin tutor came to teach the sons of the house. There is actually no record that Shakespeare was ever a tutor. That is a fictional aspect of the novel. However, that smoke-filled hall is this very one. So when Anne's father died, the house was given to Bartholomew, Anne's older brother. Here is the washroom that features in the story, where Joan, the stepmother, realises that Anne must be pregnant. Now, the upstairs didn't exist in Anne's time, so none of these bedrooms are Anne's. She would have slept downstairs with everybody else in that one main room. It was only Bartholomew later that built this upper story where you can look down onto the garden. The smoke would have risen straight up through the thatch of the roof, and you can still see that very roof up here through this hole that they've left for you to see. So it would have been very crowded in Anne's time. This kitchen would have been Anne's kitchen. The flagstones were actually laid by Anne's father. So we're literally, guys, walking in the steps of Anne Hathaway and Shakespeare when he would have come here courting, but not teaching Latin lessons like in the book. Now I'm going to take you through the garden, and I'm going to take you through the orchards, because Hewlands is surrounded by trees, and I bet back then there were even more trees than there are, and there are orchards as well as part of the farm. Anne in the book is depicted as really hard-working, and that's exactly how it would have been. She was reared to work the farm. She would have been given the chickens, she would have been given the sheep, and she would have been given bees to work with. In fact, they still sell the honey that the bees make in the cottage shop, which is fabulous. But this is the furthest orchard from the house, and the bees are at the end of here, and also woodland surrounding the house is here, and that's one of the aspects of this book that I loved. I loved the character of Anne being built as this woman profoundly connected with the magic of the forest. In fact, the forest and trees in this story right up to the very end are incredibly important. Anne's love with the forest was taught to her by her mother, who is depicted as a witchy woman in this book as well. And the book tells us, and I'm quoting, "It is said that she is strange, touched, peculiar, perhaps mad." These are words to describe Anne in the story. It carries on to say she wanders the back roads and forest at will, unaccompanied, collecting plants to make dubious potions. Agnes is said to have learnt crafts from an old crone in the book, and has used it to make medicine and to spin and to create charms. There's a hysteria depicted in the book against women in touch with nature, and especially women of crone age, and in the book is depicted as having learnt these crafts from an old crone in Shottery village. We're also told that the mother had been a gypsy or a sorceress, or even a forest sprite. The imaginings of the forest back then were, and trees and being connected to trees, was very much that of witchcraft and the magical, the other world. And I think that's why I loved Anne's depiction so much, because having spent time, especially in this corner by this wild forest on Anne's land, it just fitted so well for me. Before Shakespeare even meets her in the book, he is said to imagine her from the rumours as being half woman, half animal, thick-browed, hobbling, hair streaked with grey, clothing clotted with mud and foliage, the daughter of a dead forest witch. She will walk with a limp, muttering to herself as she fumbles in her bag of curses and cures. That is how Shakespeare is said to be imagining her in this fictional account, and in that imagining we can see the hysteria against the wild woman in touch with nature, or any woman really that steps outside of societal norms. They're gypsies, they're forest sprites. There is a revealing in that list of attributes given or imagined by William that you need to be suspicious of these women. Half animal implies that there were some strange sexual activities going on, cross species dalliances. They're immoral. Thick-browed with clothing clotted with mud is a woman who refuses to follow normal beauty rules and to be respectable, to do the right activities to keep their presentation within societal norms. The fact as well that he imagined her hair streaked with grey shows that there was a huge age factor in witchcraft suspicion. The crone is still a factor in victimising women even now, but most disconcertingly, his suspicions also circle around that idea of fumbling or muttering or being clumsy, of walking with a limp or hobbling, that idea of disability, of being othered. Disability and suspicions of witchcraft, it's all there in those imaginings of Shakespeare in the novel. Now here you can see in the sculpture garden in one of the orchards now, we've got a depiction from Hamlet, which of course is a play that is very linked to this novel with its depictions of grief, and you can see all the Shakespearean quotes underneath the vast array and multitude of trees. That link with the forest, I think, is a really important aspect of the development of Anne's character in the book, and that's why I think the setting is so important, because if you know the setting, you know that that character just feels perfect. We've all heard of the cunning woman or the witch that lives on the edge of the forest, and I think the setting of Hewlands is perfect for these type of whispers. The book says, did you ever hear about the girl who lived at the edge of the forest, when whispering about Anne? And Shottery is at the edge of Stratford. It's in its own liminal space. It's got streams surrounding it, coppices of trees around it. All the best witches and all the best female characters live in this liminal setting. Anne Hathaway's Cottage is a universal way of othering a female character into a more magical being. And we're told in the book that God-fearing people who needed to go through the forest would stop and pray. Here and there was an altar, a cross where you could pause and put your safety in the hands of the Lord. The forest becomes a magical mafia in the book, in people's minds, demanding its protection money in the form of offerings and prayer. But Anne is taught by her mother, who is also wonderfully depicted in this book, to not be scared of the forest. "Look," the mother said, "a squirrel," and a reddish flourish of tail disappeared up a trunk as if she herself had conjured it from the bark. "Look, a kingfisher," a jewel-backed arrow piercing the silver skin of a brook. "Look, hazelnuts," the mother clambering into the boughs, shaking them with her strong arms, and down came clusters of dun-jacketed pearls. I think what we see in Anne Hathaway's mother is not a witchy woman under the influence of demonic forces, which the hysteria really wanted to depict. But we see a woman connected with nature, with open eyes, a willingness to explore, and a wild curiosity. And it's with the repeated word "look" in that quote that I've just read that you can see she is passing that wild curiosity on to her children. I think the character of Anne, followed on from the character of her mother, is wonderful, and it's what makes the stepmom Joan so appalling in the book, because Joan replaces this by lopping off Anne's hair with a knife, burning the toys and the rush babies that her mom made. Joan in the book gets a really bad rap, and this is fictional. We have no evidence to say whether Joan was really like this or not. But with this poetic license with Joan's character, I think Maggie O Farrell is turning the story of Hamnet into a fairy tale. We've got the witches, the forest, we've now got the evil stepmother, we've got abandonment, we've got a woman coming through against all the odds and surviving this toxic environment. This is a fairy tale with the memories of Anne's mother keeping her buoyant through the troubles. At night, Agnes whispered to Bartholomew about the woman who liked to walk with them through the forest, who tied a stone with a hole to herbs, who made them rush babies, who had a garden of plants at the back door. She remembered it all. Almost all. So I did not expect this book, through the character of Anne, to become a witchy book and to feel like it belongs now on my shelf of witchcraft fiction. But as Anne develops powers that seem to be generational, handed down from her mom, that is exactly what I feel this book is. The women who are othered, of being too much, women who have whispered memories of that connection to nature. Anne talks about her own memories of her mom and says, the memory of what it meant to be properly loved for what you are and not what you ought to be. I love that idea of being loved for what you truly are and not what you ought to be. I think that is a battle through time that women, especially wilder women, have had to face again and again and again. And in the book, that is the sort of love that Anne feels that she's found through William. She says to herself that she won't listen to the protestations of others, their objections, their reasonings. This will be her chance, her way through the narrow hole at the heart of the stone, and nothing will stand in her way. She's found her way back to the hagstone of her mother through her love for Shakespeare in the book, and I found that full circle moment just so wonderful. She feels like she's found that love again that only lives in the memories of the way her mother loved her, a love for what you are and not what you ought to be. Shakespeare, when talking with his sister Eliza, also passes on how he feels about Anne, and we see that actually he does love her in the book in this way. Eliza remarks that, wow, she sounds peerless. William Shakespeare agrees. He says that she is peerless. And so their relationship begins, and Anne finds herself pregnant from meetings in a hut in the garden like the very one that I've just walked past. And Joan's rage takes hold and deals are done. The two characters in the book that are really depicted badly are Joan at Hewlands, and then we move to Henley Street to meet John the glovemaker, William Shakespeare's father. So you can see today, as it would have been in Shakespeare's time, Henley Street is the bustling centre of Stratford upon Avon, and here we are just coming up to what is now known as Shakespeare's birthplace, the building where Anne and then 18-year-old Shakespeare moved into after they were married. So past all the school groups learning about Shakespeare, we arrive at one of the main settings in the book, the house where the book opens with Hamnet desperately trying to help his sister Judith, who has developed plague-like symptoms. This house here. So I think we've now got to what possibly is one of my biggest bugbears about this book. It is not only the depiction of Joan, who is depicted as quite abusive over at Hewlands, but even worse than that, the character of John Shakespeare, so William's father. John's character in here is depicted as incredibly abusive. When William leaves to go to London, he's most scared that Hamnet is going to become a similar victim of abuse as he was. He tells Hamnet to always keep a good arm's length away from his grandfather, and there is no evidence at all to suggest that John was like that. In fact, when Shakespeare married Anne, because Shakespeare was only 18 and couldn't afford his own property, it was then that John built on the tiny one up one down extension on the end of the house, the first room that you come into, which you'll see in a moment, for Anne and Shakespeare to live in. In the book, it's depicted that it was done under threat from Bartholomew, because Bartholomew didn't want Anne to live with John, who he knew to be abusive, but there is no evidence of that either. In fact, the extension and the extra living space built onto this house as easily would depict John as being a really kind, supportive father. So I think when reputations are at stake, that's a real toughie to kind of feel whether I'm okay with or not. I don't think I'm okay with that, but it makes a great story. The staff, they have to fend off a lot of people saying, oh, John the glovemaker was vile, wasn't he? They have that a lot, and they have to say no, there is absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. But in this book, he is depicted as that. So let's go in and let's look at that house with that first room with the one up, one down. This is the room where, unfortunately, we see the development of the disease that has racked first Judith and then Hamnet, eventually leading to the death of Hamnet at the end of part 1 of this book. So as you can see, it's quite an extensive house on the high street, but that end part with the shield over the door is the part that Shakespeare and Anne are said to have lived in, just that tiny extension at the end, which is also known as Joan of Arc's cottage because Shakespeare's sister lived in it as well. In Anne's time, this house would have only have had that front door entrance onto the high street, but today there is a side entrance in past this lovely back garden. So this is the house where Shakespeare and Anne came to live after they were married. Shakespeare was only 18 years old. It is the house that Anne had her 3 children in, and sadly it's also the house that saw her only son Hamnet die in. This is the house that holds a huge chunk of the book of Hamnet. It's also the house that they leave from to take Hamnet to Trinity Church to be buried. And as you step in, this is it. This is the room where all of that happens. There, the fireplace where the sick children will lay in front of. Such a tiny little space. That is an understairs cupboard. To the side of it is the doorway up the stairs, which you now can't access. And that's it. Step through that and you're in the main body of the house then, which wasn't where Anne and Shakespeare lived, but these floors were floors that they walked on. We have the parlour, which has, strangely, a bed in it. Look at the amazing wall coverings as well. All of the windows look directly out onto the high street. There would have been no glass in the windows in Anne and Shakespeare's time. Instead, they would have used wax covered shields to put up of a night to protect them, like these here. I just love walking through this house. I think it's incredible. The end room, you get to John's workshop and shop where he sold gloves of different standards and pockets that he made directly to people on the high street. Now, what we do know about John is he was a bit of a cad. There were unpaid debts, there was trouble in town, but we know what he was like in business, but we don't know what he was like as a family man. And that's the issue that I have with his character taking such a bad rap in the book. You go up the stairs and you have, this would have been the children's room with wooden toys. And you can see that hysteria against witches with those witch marks over mantelpieces to prevent witches from flying down chimneys. There they are again, in the very room where Shakespeare was born, in front of this fire on these very floorboards. But this time it's the attic that I've come back to see, because in the novel Hamnet, Anne describes this house as an A, and she struggles to sleep in it. She says, because the floor is floating in mid-air like the cross stroke of the A, there is no ground underneath it, just empty space and more empty space. His face breaks into a smile, his eyes examining her intently, and he flops back to the bed. Do you know, he says, addressing the covering above him, that this is the foremost reason I love you? That I cannot sleep in the air? No, that you see the world as no one else does. As I step out of the property now into the back garden, I do ponder the fact that this isn't really the place that Anne and William would have slept. However, it's very clear when you read the book that it's that attic section in the shape of an A that would have inspired Maggie O Farrell to write that as their bedroom. Then, leaving the property, we walked through Stratford. I wanted to retrace the steps that Anne and William take in the book, being stared at by the locals, to walk to Trinity Church to bury their son Hamnet after he dies. I think this part of the book is just so intense in its grief and in its writing of grief, and the depiction of a mother's grief, I think, is the most powerful aspect of the book. When you get here, which is actually where the end of the gardens would have been for Shakespeare's new house that he built further on in the future, you had an option. They would have either walked along the river or they would have walked along this back street to the church, but this is the path that they would have taken until they arrived here. This is the most incredible church. This is Holy Trinity Church at the far end of Stratford, at the far end of the river. You can see here in the flagstone as you go through the gates are depicted as Anne not wanting to leave because of the shock of the grave and the fact that she doesn't want to leave her child alone in the grave. This walk is the walk that Anne would have done, and it breaks my heart walking it. My mother's heart breaks for the Anne, not only the Anne in the book, but the Anne in real life that would have walked from this doorway in that state of grief and shock that is so incredibly well depicted in the book. I think ultimately this book's force is that depiction of a mother's grief. In the book there is a funny thing played with time in this last part of the book. There is time speeding up for Shakespeare, who's in London frantically trying to get home before his son dies, but there is also a slowing down of time for Anne. Everything seems to go in slow motion for Anne in part 2 when she is in the throes of new grief for Hamnet, and I thought that use of time was absolutely incredible. Now, before I step into the church to show you the space where Hamnet's funeral would have been, I'm going to take you down round this corner, because it's round this corner that Maggie O Farrell depicts Hamnet's grave as being dug. We're told that Hamnet loved water, and he would have been very, very happy with a grave overlooking the water. And as we come round this corner, you will see that this incredible building, it does indeed back onto the very banks of the River Avon. It is in the most spectacular setting, a graveyard with this magnificent church and all the history here on the banks of a river. It is glorious. Now, we are not exactly sure where Hamnet or Judith were buried in this churchyard. We do know that Hamnet did not die of the plague as depicted in the book. For reason being, the plague wasn't in Stratford the year that Hamnet died, and also if it had been a plague death, Hamnet would not have been allowed to have been buried in this graveyard. So although we don't know what Hamnet died of, we do know that it wasn't the plague. And now we loop ourselves back to the start of this story, to Anne Hathaway's cottage, A Mother's Love, and the magic of the forest and the trees. Because with the idea of trees and magical trees, there is a twist at the end of this tale in this graveyard. Because having spoken to the lovely staff in the Shakespeare Trust, also to help us in the church here today, I was very keen to find out if the graves of the children are marked anywhere. Of course, Shakespeare is buried inside this incredible church, which I didn't have time actually to go and see his grave, but it was Hamnet's grave that I wanted to find. Now, Maggie O Farrell, when she wrote the book, she found out that the graves of the children, so the twins Judith and Hamnet, weren't marked in the graveyard, and she campaigned and worked with the vicar to address that, and the staff in the church told me to go back up the walk and to look on my right to see newly planted rowan trees, and there, mirroring the trees and the plaques in Anne Hathaway's house at Hewlands, I would find the plaques, these now new remembrance plaques for the twins. So we come full circle with the magic of a rowan tree, the magic of the forest, back to Anne and the grave of Hamnet Shakespeare. We find as well, lying next to Hamnet, as in the book Hamnet, his sister Judith once more lying next to him. And that magic of the rowan tree, the magic that Maggie has sprinkled throughout this book, does turn it into a fairy tale-esque depiction with your evil stepmother. The magic of trees, the magic of wild women and a mother's love. I think the wildness of the mother's love is as fabulously depicted as the grief of the mother in loss. And I bring you finally to New Place. So this is where Shakespeare's house, when he returned to Stratford after he'd made all his money, would have stood. It is no longer here. We can just see Nash's house, which was the neighbour's house. Shakespeare's house has long since gone, but Anne's gardens are still here. The gardens that we see her finding her hope once more in the book. So let's leave this video on a note of hope. These gardens are incredibly extensive. They would have been even bigger in Anne's time, stretching all the way down to the river, which is unbelievable. The playwright in London really did do well, even in his own time. So the surprise of Anne in the book of ending up in a place like this would have been very real. And what a fantastic place for her to mend and find a way to move on. The wild woman tending a garden with her hands in the soil. It is a well-known cure for the wild woman. Thanks guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.